Because it's a big day at the Center Square with my colleague TJ Martinell, our state investigative reporter, getting a hold of nearly 1,000 pages of public records from the office of Attorney General Nick Brown. Now, his beat is normal public disclosure requests. He's always putting these out as an investigative reporter. You want to find out what people are talking about behind the scenes. Oftentimes, it takes, putting in these FOIA requests, Freedom of Information Act requests, or public disclosure requests, PDRs, to get these documents back. So he's doing that all the time. He received probably the doozy of all doozies as far as public records requests back last Friday regarding the income tax. And it revealed more than he would expect to gain normally. I think that's part of what he shared with me. Here is part of my conversation earlier today with the Center Square's investigative reporter, TJ Martinell.
Yeah, so I asked for any communications and legal advice regarding the Senate version of the bill and also the House version of the bill. And what I received the other day was 988 pages of public records. And what it contains is internal communications within the Attorney General's office, communications with lawmakers, communications even with the governor's office regarding the legality of a millionaire's tax, which imposes a 9.9% tax on the income of people who make $1 million or more annually. And so, what was interesting about these records and fascinating is the the framing of the bill's purpose was very explicitly, in no uncertain terms, was to overturn the 1933 Colleton decision, which declared that income was property under the state constitution. Now, some people might wonder why that matters. Well, because uh, the voters back in the 30s tried to impose a progressive income tax, and what the Supreme Court said was you can't do that because we have a state constitutional amendment that says that property taxes have to be uniform in nature, they can't exceed 1%, and that rate is determined by class. And so also we have a definition of property that's defined to be all things tangible and intangible subject to ownership. So ever since then, the state Supreme Court has unanimously and consistently ruled that income is property under our 14th Amendment in the state constitution. What they're saying in these emails, both members of the Attorney General's office and state lawmakers, is this bill is being crafted in a way so that it will force the state Supreme Court to address the Colleton decision and determine once again, after so many Supreme Court rulings, after so many voters rejecting an income tax, whether or not income is property. And so what it means is that this bill is not intended, this millionaire's tax is not intended to generate revenue for whatever programs they're doing. Its purpose, its true purpose, its primary purpose is to overturn almost a century's worth of legal precedent in which the Supreme Court at one point said it is no longer a question to this court whether income is property.
So you can believe there will be much more to come on this exclusive story in the days and weeks to come. On our Center Square Washington page, TJ's article today revealing his discovery and the exclusive documents he obtained. I would recommend you check that out. And we're going to have continuing reaction this week from state lawmakers on both sides of the aisle, from some policy folks that are weighing in, supporters and opponents of the income tax, as well as the legal team fighting all of this. Citizen Action Defense Fund has secured former state AG Rob McKenna, as well as former state Supreme Court Justice and state lawmaker, Democrat Phil Talmadge, leading the effort, along with some folks we've introduced to you on previous episodes of Washington in Focus Daily, for the legal challenge filed in Klickitat County Superior Court against the income tax. I have no doubt that TJ's discovery and the documents he has obtained are going to be part of this legal argument moving forward. So we are excited about the opportunity to share a lot more on that in the days to come. And now, Senator John Braun, Republican from Centralia, current Republican leader in the Senate, is looking for a promotion. He is hoping to unseat Democratic incumbent Representative Marie Gluesenkamp Perez in the 3rd District. That's in Southwest Washington. I spoke with him this morning about how the campaign is going. Fundraising, as the incumbent has outpaced him at this point, even though he has the endorsement of President Trump, and what people are talking to him about on the campaign trail. Of course, he's running for federal office, but he's, been a state lawmaker for many years and has a prominent position as the state minority leader. He said he goes out on these campaign events and everything everybody wants to talk about is affordability or lack thereof in Washington. And the income tax, he said, is of great interest.
It is the top issue when I go to talk to people, and whether it's as a legislator or as a candidate for Congress, the top issue people bring up is the state's income tax, and we haven't heard a peep from my opponent on this tax, what she thinks about it, whether she's willing to push back with her colleagues in the Democratic Party and say this is wrong for the state of Washington. But I can tell you, overwhelmingly, this is very unpopular. Nobody believes that it's going to stay on high earners. Everybody understands that this is the first step, and the next step is to reduce the deduction so that everybody pays this in the future.
I did reach out to the incumbent's office, Representative Marie Glusenkamp Perez, for comment on this. If they respond, I will include that in tomorrow's episode of Washington in Focus Daily, as well as further comments from Senator Braun. As she's got a bigger war chest at this point, and with 6.5 months to go in the campaign, and you can bet that campaign ads are going to start fast and furious, I'm sure, over the summer. Um, it's going to be interesting to see how the race plays out. She has far more money at this point, but he's hoping that there's going to be some folks stepping up, especially given how high profile this race is. That district, that third district, is a purple district. It can really go either way. And as far as members of U.S. Congress are concerned, they believe this is a winnable race, and that's why he has the endorsement of President Trump. But it's going to come down to the final months of this campaign.
Jackson, thanks for taking the time to chat about my story, which is available on the centersquare.com/Washington news site. So what we found is, or what I received was 988 pages of documents and emails of communication between the Attorney General's office and state legislators, specifically Senator Jamie Peterson from Seattle, and it was discussing the millionaire's tax. And what was so unique about these communications is that they explicitly say that the purpose of the tax wasn't to collect revenue to fund certain programs, but to get a 1933 state Supreme Court decision named Colleton overturned, which would allow for a progressive income tax. So, everything's on the website now. The emails are there for people to read and download. So, what was your reaction when you read those emails?
Yeah, I think it confirms what was the worst kept secret in Olympia, which is that this entire piece of legislation was specifically designed to force a reversal of 100 years of case law. And I think it's a little bit of a situation where, like the line from Casablanca, we now know that there's gambling going on in the casino. And so, it's a peek behind the curtain at that process. So, obviously legislators have a right to introduce bills, and if they disagree with constitutional rulings of the court, part of their job, I think, sometimes is to test those boundaries. I think what is a little bit odd here is that you have the Attorney General, helping them in that process. And I know that attorneys within the AG's office represent agencies, and they should. It really raises the question of what is the appropriate role of the Attorney General in constitutional cases and in advising on constitutional legislation, and do they have the right and the duty to advise other constitutional officials that no, you can't do what you're going to do because it would violate the Constitution. And I think there is some discretion there, and you don't have to look any further than 2016, when then Attorney General Bob Ferguson refused to defend state law in response to a tax that the city of Seattle had passed on firearms. And you can agree or disagree on whether or not that's good policy. But the larger issue is the attorney general at the time said, look, I so disagree with the state of the law that I'm not even going to bother to defend it here, and to, and to just sort of go with what the legislative body, in that instance, the Seattle, um, city government, I'm not even going to bother to try to challenge their actions there. And so, I think the AG's office seems to be exercising discretion in a very political way, instead of doing what they should be doing, which is to defend the law of the state of Washington and defend the Constitution.
Yeah, I think what really struck, because we really almost have to pull back, because and see, this on in theory or on paper, the millionaire's tax is supposed to provide revenue to fund certain programs. That's what a tax should be. But this isn't even trying to change tax policy, and it's not trying to socially engineer anything. This tax was written specifically and very carefully so that it would force the state Supreme Court to take up this issue. And what was interesting is how the Attorney General's office didn't say, like, because an attorney could have said, you know what, I can advise you on what you can do, and here's some stuff, but I don't feel comfortable advising you on how to get legal precedent. And I think that that's the other thing. This isn't some decision that was made 5 years ago. This wasn't a decision that was made 10 years ago or 50 years ago or even 70 years ago. It was made back in 1933. And not to mention the fact that it's not like this was just one decision that's been made over the last century. There's been numerous Supreme Court rulings. One was very, very concise. It just said, if you want a progressive income tax, go to the voters. And they have gone to the voters, and the voters have said no every single time, at least since the 30s. And so that's really just raises this question of, what is actually going on as far as, um, I mean, is this, it seems like it's really walking this fine line of ethical behavior.
Of what behavior? I'm sorry.
It's almost like an attorney who's advising their client how to do something that, according to precedent, is illegal. I mean, that's kind of what isn't that what they're doing? They're basically saying, yeah, this is illegal, and we're going to help you tailor it so it could get declared. It almost reminds me of that line from Phantom Menace, where Palpatine says, "I will make it legal," right?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, there's a line too of and I don't know if this comes from Napoleon or someone from that era, but there's the law, and then there's what is done.
Yeah.
And there's a little bit of that, of the idea that well, I mean, yeah, I think a better analogy is probably Pirates of the Caribbean, that the
More like guidelines and actual rules.
yeah, the Constitution is just guidelines, right? Like the Pirates Code. I mean, the fact of the matter is, it should be taken seriously, and it should have been incorporated into the advice that they were providing. And so I think that's concerning. I thought it was also a little weird, frankly, that the attorney general is advising the legislature on how to get around public scrutiny and the opportunity for the public to weigh in by saying, oh, by the way, you may want to include this clause, otherwise the people might have a chance to challenge this with a referendum. And again, it's not really.
Well, also, speaking of which, what does that tell you about what he thinks of what the voters are going to say?
Well,
I mean, because if they think that the voters support this, well, okay, great, let's run a referendum. Let's let the people demonstrate that they support this tax.
Well, I think the fact that the voters have rejected it so many times is why he gave that specific advice of, hey, if you don't want to have them potentially shoot this down once again, here's a drafting suggestion you could have to prevent that. So yeah, that was odd. And then it was very, I think, illuminating to the whole discussion over the marriage tax and how and the marriage penalty, and how the the courts have looked at whether or not state actions are impacting marriage and penalizing that in a way that violates the fundamental right of people to marry. And while they did not think that the way that this was structured would infringe on that, I think that's another, another concern here. I mean, the impact of the tax is that individuals would not be subject to it, but the fact that they're married, if they have a certain income level over what's in the statute, could penalize them very heavily. I think is another interesting legal argument on this that clearly they were aware of and ignored.
I think what's going to be really interesting is how now that this is out in the open, it's really going to change the debate around the millionaire's tax, because the proponents are not going to be able to say, oh, well, we're just making the wealthy pay their fair share. That's gone forever, because this isn't a bunch of random people speculating who are just these small level bureaucrats. This is the Solicitor General. This is senior counsel for the Attorney General's office. This is the prime sponsor of the bill saying, I want this written so it'll overturn Colton and force the state Supreme Court to take up this issue. And so critics of this can just point out, this entire bill's purpose is so that everyone is subject to an income tax at any rate by a simple majority of the legislature.
Yeah, the peek behind the curtain shows that this isn't about just making the rich pay their fair share and going after millionaires. They want to go after everybody in the state and expand it. And the AG's office is essentially giving them a how-to manual in how to accomplish that and expand this thing through some favorable court decisions to every single person in the state. And that should be really disturbing and troubling, especially since they argued so much that that's not what this is about, that there's no plans whatsoever to expand it. And we see since at least August of 2025, that's exactly what they were trying to tee up.
I think what's also interesting is because there was the Quinn decision a couple of years ago and then the state Supreme Court upheld an income tax on capital gains, which they called an excise tax. But it really makes you wonder, what did the Attorney General's office advise that bill's prime sponsor when they were working on that? It raises so many questions. And like you were saying, this was a peek behind a curtain. This was a peek, to pardon the expression, but it was a peek behind an iron curtain we weren't supposed to look past. It was kind of like, the curtain in The Wizard of Oz or something like that, where you weren't supposed to see them having these discussions, because the people in these emails were talking with the assumption that the public would never see this. They would never know that this is going on.
Yeah, and again, the AG's office certainly does provide legal advice to legislators, and they have a lot of attorneys that do that, and the legislature has their own attorneys that help with that process. So I like your Wizard of Oz analogy. I mean, you're definitely kind of seeing the process used to get this thing up, and we get a peek at some of the arguments that they're going to raise and sort of the motivation. I do think it will be ultimately helpful in our litigation on the income tax suit to have this kind of insight into the intent behind the legislature in drafting some of these clauses.
Right. I think the other thing that's interesting is, let's say this income tax gets the Supreme Court just says, you know what, we're not overturning a century's worth of Supreme Court decisions, and you didn't, the Attorney General's office, you didn't make the case that we needed. It gets overturned, but great, people are already leaving the state over this. I mean, this was let's put aside the amount of time spent preparing the legal memos, the communications, the use of public resources to craft a bill intended to overturn, Supreme Court decisions. But even if it doesn't stay on the books, people are still leaving. And so what is that economic cost of that? I mean, that's another interesting, there's just a lot of different things that this implications and I'd say consequences, ramifications of this tax that they're for the sole purpose of getting a Supreme Court decision that's been upheld unanimously throughout its history overturned.
Yeah, they seem to be so focused on, can we do this, or how can we get the court to overturn this decision to allow us to do it. You don't see a whole lot of discussion in those emails about, should we do it? Is this really a good policy? Is this going to be best for the state? And you're already seeing people vote with their feet and leaving the state. You're seeing a tremendous pushback in terms of, support for the litigation and support for other efforts by other groups to, challenge this by a referendum or initiative. And so I think the lack of real discussion of the policy implications of, is this a good idea? Are also interesting. They're wargaming. You brought up the capital gains tax. The discussion there about how, well, I don't think you want to label it an excise tax like we did last time. We were able to sell it then, but you don't want to do it now if your goal is to really challenge this. We should just call it, what it is. And so there's some gamesmanship there that I think is a little odd. And then they even suggest, other legislation like a payroll tax that they think is more defensible. So,
Yeah.
look, I get that attorneys are supposed to help their clients meet their goals, but again, I do believe that the attorney general should have a higher duty, and the folks that work for him should have a higher duty to the law and to Constitution, and should keep the good of the people in mind when they're making these decisions and when they're providing that advice. And it does not appear. It appears that they were narrowly focused on the questions that state senator wanted to ask instead of sort of the larger issues at play here.
Welcome to another episode of Washington in Focus. I'm your host, Tim Klauser, here with the Center Square's Washington State investigative reporter, TJ Martinell, talking about a recent breaking story of his involving hundreds of pages of records from the state attorney general's office, discussing with the Senate Majority Leader how to potentially overturn a state Supreme Court ruling recognizing income as property as a way to push a graduated progressive income tax potentially onto residents like you and I. TJ, why don't you tell us a little bit about the records that you got and how opponents to the millionaire's tax are responding?
Well, I mean, what happened is I got public records back. I filed a public records request requesting communications within the Attorney General's office regarding the legality of the millionaire's tax. I was really curious to see what emails they were getting from people saying, hey, is this thing legal? Is this going to survive a court challenge? All this stuff. Just there was a lot of questions, and they're the top attorneys for state agencies and all that kind of stuff. So they're going to be issuing legal opinions or giving legal advice. So the other day I got a massive batch of records, and it was internal communications within the Attorney General's office. It was also communications with them and primarily Senator Jamie Peterson about his millionaire's tax. And what is so remarkable about these records is that they were very, very explicit and very, very precise about what the purpose of the bill is. And so in normal world, you introduce a bill like a tax, and it's intended to tax certain types of activities, and it's intended to raise revenue for certain types of programs. That's the purpose, on the surface, on paper. But in these emails, he made it clear that the purpose of him introducing this bill is not to impose a tax on millionaires, and it's not intended to fund these programs. It's intended to overturn a century's worth of legal precedent in which income is considered property under our state constitution. And what that means is you cannot have a progressive income tax in our state. You can have a flat rate income tax that's below 1%, but you cannot have a progressive income tax where different incomes are taxed at different levels. And that's due to a provision in our state constitution that was added in the 1930s. And advocates for that amendment at the time said the reason for the amendment was so that they could tax income as a separate class of property than land. So they're trying to get this precedent overturned, in which every single Supreme Court that has ever existed in Washington state history since this ruling has said income is property. They even said at one point in a ruling, we're done having this conversation. If you want a progressive income tax, go to the voters. And so this is the purpose of this bill. This has completely destroyed any advocacy for this millionaire's tax that is only going to apply to the wealthy, and it's making the wealthy pay their fair share, whatever that means. That's gone. No one can say that, because we have emails from the prime sponsor himself saying the purpose of this bill is to overturn a legal case law of a century so that we can impose a progressive income tax that could apply to every single person in the state that makes income, and we can tax them at any rate that we want. So that's that's pretty much what's happening. And the Attorney General's office was very much I just, for lack of a better word, they were very much in favor of helping this outcome. And that's kind of what muddles the waters a little bit, is that it's not as if they gave legal advice from a neutral perspective of, we don't know if this is legal or if it'll stand up. I mean, they did say, we don't know if the Supreme Court will rule in your favor, but we agree that we do not believe that income is property. That was the legal opinion of the Attorney General's office as it exists right now. So
it's interesting because the House and the Senate, they have their own lawyers. The AGO is the people's lawyer. They represent us, the residents of the state of Washington. They're supposed to be upholding and defending the Constitution. But here you have records showing AGO staff directing or coaching the state Democratic leaders on how to potentially pose this question to the Supreme Court.
Right.
Not saying that they can directly overturn it themselves, but how do they get this to the Supreme Court? And you're saying this is a millionaire's tax, but it's not intended as a tax on millionaire. It's intended as a test run to get this before residents like you and I and others that don't make $1 million.
Right.
That was asked of the state Democratic leaders repeatedly throughout the last session, was that, will this hit everyday Washingtonians next year or the year after? And their answer was repeatedly, we don't want to bind future legislatures. That's not our job. And now you have these records saying, where Senate Majority Leader Jamie Peterson said himself, I would like the 9.9% tax rate to just be the start.
Yes. I mean,
who's next?
Well, and I think that they say they don't want to bind future legislatures. Well, okay, then you don't say this only applies to the millionaires. I mean, if you can change a law, then there's that saying, I think it was Ronald Reagan who said, there's nothing more permanent than a temporary government program. There's nothing more temporary than a tax that's applied only to specific people. The IRS income tax, the federal income tax, only applied to the very wealthy when it was first introduced. And now, as we all know, pretty much everyone has to file an income tax return. And there's an entire legal industry that is dedicated to navigating the IRS tax code. And theoretically, we could see that happen here. And I think that's part of not to go too far off on a tangent, but I think going back, the one thing that I found really unsettling with the Attorney General's office is when Solicitor General Noah Purcell noted to Jamie Peterson that his bill did not have an emergency clause. And so emergency clauses, for people who don't know, does two things. The bill takes effect immediately upon the governor's signature rather than 90 days. Two, it prevents a referendum from being run where voters get to weigh in on whether to uphold or reject that bill in the November election. And so he literally says in the email, if you don't have this, there could be a referendum run against it. And that begs the question of, so what you're saying is the voters would overturn this yet again, which they've done 10 times over decades since this Supreme Court decision. I mean, Initiative 1098 would have imposed a progressive income tax in 2010. It was decisively defeated. I think there was only a couple precincts in Seattle that voted in favor of it, like these hardcore areas, but everywhere else it was overwhelmingly rejected by voters, which is why they've turned to these legal maneuvers, because they know if they go, frankly, it's very obvious. If they thought voters supported this, they would go to voters.
Yeah, these are lawmakers that are supposed to be representing the people. The Democrats, they hold the majority in both chambers of the legislature, yet they don't want to allow their own constituents the ability to weigh in on this. And should they pass it? Okay, at least they gave the voters a chance, but they're trying to stop them. And now you have organizations like Let's Go Washington with a case expedited to the Supreme Court
Right.
to potentially allow a referendum later this month or next month. But at the same time, we have another case going on, I believe, in Thurston County or somewhere down towards Olympia to potentially block the implementation of this income tax, this millionaire's tax. And that could take months to a year or more. And
Yeah.
it's destined to hit the state
I,
Supreme Court, which is where things are really going to get interesting, TJ, because one of the governor's recent appointees, Colleen Medley, she'll be up for election later this year, so maybe she'll leave the bench before the case reaches the Supreme Court. But Noah Purcell, who you mentioned, in January, he came out and said he gave the strongest endorsement possible of Colleen Medley. But meanwhile, he's in the background coaching lawmakers on how to overturn this tax. And now they're putting a justice on the Supreme Court who worked with Purcell, who worked with Ferguson when he was attorney general, who is aligned with them and could potentially rule in favor of this tax.
yeah. I mean, that's pretty much what's going on. And what's so funny about him saying that we need an emergency clause is that the tax doesn't take effect until 2028, and the state doesn't begin collecting revenue until 2029. So we're talking 3 years before the state starts seeing any revenue from this. So what's the emergency? If this was an emergency, the tax would you would begin collecting the tax as soon as possible. If that was so important. I think the other thing that, I mean, there's so many different things to be said about this discovery and these records and this, because let's say it goes all the way to the Supreme Court and the Supreme Court just says, you know what? I don't know what you guys aren't getting. Income is property in Washington state. Stop. Like, we're done. Great. Now the tax is overturned. How much money has been wasted on this bill? And not to mention the fact that how many millionaires have already left the state and will never come back.
Mhm.
Like how much
It'll
is this going to cost not just taxpayers, but it's going to cost the state revenue when the real estate excise tax goes downhill because nobody wants to buy a home over certain amounts of money that generates a lot of the revenue because they're like, I have tons of money. And then they proposed a wealth tax in the past, which I also got the legal memo for as part of this public records about whether or not a wealth tax could survive legal scrutiny. I mean, you've already had Jeff Bezos leave the state, move to Florida, sell his stock, and reap the rewards, and the state didn't get a penny. And this was before the income tax. And then, the Starbucks CEO is leaving or has announced he's leaving the state. And they just announced today that Starbucks is opening up a headquarters in Nashville. I mean, I don't think either they do and they don't care, or there's another reason, or they don't understand that people are leaving. And the tech sector is what has propelled Washington's economy from being kind of just ho-hum in the 2010s to being one of the big powerhouses in the country. I mean, a couple of years ago, Washington State was just flying high as far as tax revenue was concerned, and the economy, and there was jobs everywhere. And downtown Seattle was being basically transformed because of the economic boom. There were how many cranes were in the air when activity was going on. And now you're having corporations like Starbucks moving potentially in response to this kind of stuff. So it's just, what's the unseen cost of this legal maneuver? Because it's not even appropriate to call it a millionaire's tax anymore, because they're not collecting revenue for 3 years, and its actual purpose, by the prime bill sponsor's own words, is to overturn a legal precedent. So, which means as soon as that legal precedent is overturned, they're going to go back and change the tax. They're going to change who it applies to, and they're going to change what the rate is. So, like I said, these records have completely destroyed advocacy of this tax as a tax, because it's not.
It's a pivotal moment in state history, and the outcome now rests in the hands of the state Supreme Court when they potentially rule on the constitutionality of this income tax later this year or next year. For the audience listening, 5 of those 9 Supreme Court seats are up for election this fall, with a few conservative challengers entering the race, kind of giving residents an option to weigh in through the ballot on the income tax before a potential referendum comes up, should it. But TJ, I appreciate you covering this. It's something we'll keep our eyes on in the months ahead, especially as those Supreme Court elections come up. But for anyone hoping to catch that coverage, you can read it at thecentersquare.com. Otherwise, thank you for joining us for another episode of Washington in Focus.